to The Brew, the talk show that explores queer spirituality, social issues, and pagan culture with me, your host, Dr. John Michael Salvato. Hey, everybody, welcome to another broadcast of The Brew, a weekly talk show focused on queer pagan spirituality and culture. I'm your host, Dr. John Michael Salvato, and if you're watching for the first time, go ahead and do me a favor. In the comments, drop a hello and tell us where you're watching from. And if you're watching on the replay, do the same thing. Go ahead and leave us a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Before we begin, I always like to remind everybody that by definition, our show is geared toward those who dance to the beat of a different drum. And that includes members of the LGBTQ community, its allies, those who have some sort of connection to the community or affinity to us. And guests on the show may or may not identify as LGBTQ persons themselves. But we welcome everyone who's interested in the topics that we share. This is your program as much as it is mine. And so that means we love to hear from you. We love to have you comment or ask questions during the broadcast. Richard from New York, great to see you. And in just a short period of time, I can understand why you guys love Ellen and Valery. So guys, if you're watching live or if you're listening to our podcast on iTunes or Spotify, we would love to hear from you. And we do make every effort to pass any comments or questions on after the show for those who do catch us on the rebroadcast. So for those watching live, those on the it never fails. Every time we start the show, somebody ends up driving by on a motorcycle. So I guess that means it is time to get started. I'm really excited about our guests today. I'm really thrilled about the book that we're going to be talking about. I'm really thrilled to hear these ladies' perspective. And so let me just tell you a little bit about our guests. And I have really truncated notes on the screen in front of me. So I apologize in advance if I leave important parts out, and I will allow these ladies to kind of fix or add to what I share. But our first guest, born in the late 50s, was raised in California before moving to Queens. Ellen Matzer received her RN in 1978. After serving as an assistant head nurse at the ICU at Roosevelt Hospital in 1981, she began noticing an uptick in the number of young men coming to the ICU with respiratory infections such as pneumocystis carinii pneumonia, rapidly progressing toward severe illness and eventually death. In 1985, she joined the staff at the first designated AIDS center in New York City, that's St. Clair's Hospital and Health Center, going on to receive her bachelor's in nursing the following year. Since that time, she served as the nursing manager at Lenox Hill AIDS Center. She's received her critical care certification and currently works as an educator with another Long Island hospital, as well as serving on the clinical faculty at a Long Island nursing school. She lives with her husband of 11 years and has 2 grown children. And our second guest is her partner in the book, her co-author, Valery Hughes. And now Valery was born shortly before Ellen in Queens. She received her RN from City University in Queensborough Community College. Along the way, she worked in hospitals as a staff nurse in surgery, surgical intensive care, and emergency medicine. Valery spent a short time in Thailand working at the admissions ward, or what we would call the emergency department here, at the hospital at Khao I Dong refugee camp in the Thai-Cambodian border. Returning to New York City in 1981, she found the ICUs were filling up at that time, as many of us remember, with young men with a peculiar immunodeficiency, which at that time was being called GRID. and then just after that arc. Ultimately, she became a family nurse practitioner so she could begin to pursue her interest in providing primary care for those living with HIV infection. In 1999, she moved to the Cornell Medical College to work in HIV clinical trials. During the past 20 years, she has been a study coordinator for many of the studies that helped define HIV treatment drugs, regimens, as well as helping to define specific issues around HIV infection, including cardiovascular disease, lipodystrophy, and aging. She's worked on 2 preventative studies funded by the HPTN, the HIV Prevention Trials Network, and plans to retire from this position in 2019, this year. Valery lives with her wife of 37 years in Manhattan, and let me bring them into the room here, into the stream. Valery and Ellen, thank you so much for being here and welcome. Did I miss anything really important there?
No, that was good.
It's great. It's great.
Well, what I'd like to do, first of all, guys, if you're watching, watching the broadcast live, and you've got any questions along the way, please be sure to put them in the comments, and I'll try to be mindful of that and share them on the screen so that our guests can answer us. And like I said, like we were talking before the show, I found myself on page 2 of your book. And I've been referring to the book. The most important thing that I failed to say on there was their book that's just been released is called Nurses on the Inside, not Nurses on the Edge, as I originally somehow put it. I think I was projecting there. Nurses on the Inside. Tell me the full title of the book there, because I just keep referring it to it that way.
Nurses on the Inside, Stories of...
Oh, I just lost your audio.
Stories of the HIV epidemic.
Perfect. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to try muting my microphone when you guys are talking. So as I started reading the book, page 2, page 1 starts with a scene in 1979 as a young man would would come into what they would call eventually the AIDS ward. At the time, as you both know, and many of our viewers know, it was known as GRID, and actually 1979 it wasn't even known as anything. We were just trying to figure out what it was, and he was about to be intubated with what I presume was PCP, and that was about the time for me, Christmas Eve, in fact, of that year, when one of the first of my friends, Rick Welikoff, died. And 4 years before my being raped and beaten at gunpoint by 4 assailants in South Florida, put me in the same situation. So it was right off the bat, it was very evocative. It was one of those things that I don't think any of us could have prepared for. I wasn't yet a physician myself, but talk to us a little bit about each of your journeys of how you got to that point, and what were those early days like? What was what was going through your mind as we started to see Giardia start to show up in crazy numbers, especially in the New York area, as guys were coming home from from Fire Island, and all of a sudden we saw 4 and 6 and 8 cases of Giardia that wasn't seen before. PCP, which we never really saw in this particular population, and of course as we got into 1980, 81, manifestations of KS that we generally saw in older Mediterranean men. What was going through your minds at that time as you found yourselves in that situation?
Well, we started off in the ICU, so we started seeing patients with very latent infections, and no doubt these young men had been ill for some time before that, complaining of flu-like symptoms, perhaps night sweats, some weight loss. Most of them, we found out much later, had been to a doctor who thought that they had a flu-like syndrome or a virus and told them to go home and rest and take chicken soup and fluids. And that's what everybody thought. And when we were at the end receiving them, they had probably been ill for a while, coming in severe respiratory distress, respiratory failure, needing to be intubated, put on a ventilator, and often died before we figured out what happened.
Yeah, so the cases of Giardia that you talked about, that's not the kind of thing that we would have seen in the ICU. So that's why we had such a fragmented picture of what was going on. We didn't really know what was going on either. You have to remember that we sort of worked in a bubble. We worked in our ICU. We didn't really talk to other nurses in other hospitals. So we didn't really know what was going on. As far as we knew, that this was just one case after the other of a peculiar adult respiratory distress syndrome, and we couldn't figure it out. And certainly the cases we saw in 1979 were completely out of our understanding. It really wasn't until probably 1981 that we really started to get a full picture of what was going on. And that's when, of course, everybody started figuring it out, because they weren't just seeing PCP, they were starting to see KS lesions. And we did see KS lesions, but we didn't know what they were. We thought it was purpura from low platelets, which is what happens when you bleed a little under your skin, because it looks purplish. So we really missed a lot of that. We had no idea. And it wasn't until the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report in 1981 came out that anybody knew, because there were no textbooks and there were no journal articles. There was nobody knew anything. We all just worked in our little hospitals, and that's why we thought it was peculiar to us.
And MMRW was getting it wrong in the beginning, because, as you just said, there wasn't necessarily a clear picture putting it all together. These were seemingly isolated cases, and we weren't seeing the same thing all across the country. In some populations across the country, we were seeing more KS. In others, we were seeing in New York. I know I was there at the time. I was living in Greenwich Village, and we were seeing a lot more of our friends in the hospital with PCP. And like you said, we didn't make the connection to the guys who came home from the island and had Giardia. We just thought that was something else, and so I couldn't help but think, as I was reading that book, I was thinking, reading your book, I was thinking of that scene in the beginning of Longtime Companion. And I mean, the opening section of your book, it really just kind of took me right to that place. And what was it that, when at a period of time when I was seeing panic in the medical care community, I was seeing that's when we wore full body condoms before even going into the room. What was it in you that inspired you or compelled you to be part of that caregiving process from the very beginning? Because to me, that's really extraordinary. And we'll talk more about the later years, but I mean, 1979, 80, 81 were really the beginning of the panic years. And what was it that just inspired you ladies to say, these people need our care, and these people need compassionate care? And that comes across, I knew that was going to happen. That comes across so powerfully in your book, that I think for a lot of us watching, that we would not have been able to, people like me wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have gone on to become a physician. I wanted to be an attorney. I had absolutely no desire to practice medicine. I became a physician because there weren't enough physicians that I was seeing compassionate care given from. But the one place I saw that from the very beginning was the nursing staff. And tell us that backstory.
Gosh, that's long and involved, but For me, I always was interested in taking care of the patient that nobody else wanted. I am not worried about a challenge. And there was a lot of anti-gay sentiment then, and I was a very closeted lesbian, and I had to take care of my people. That's one thing. The other thing was is that even if they weren't my people, and the women who came in certainly, were my age, and some of them were white and some of them were not, but people did not want to take care of them. People were so afraid. And my feeling was is that after all the things that we'd done and all those years that we really did know this disease was around, if we were capable of catching it by just rendering care, we already would have been infected. We all would have known already. And so we thought, both of us felt like the panic was unwarranted. This was not a doorknob issue. And, you have to look at it from a scientific perspective. And thank God that's one of the things that you get taught in nursing school, is how to think in a scientific perspective.
And before we hear from Valery, I want to share something that one of the ladies in the book shared with us. Mary Marcus says, she was in the ER and saw pneumonia, capaces, invasive shingles, and RNs weren't using gloves for drawing blood or starting IVs, or a lot of other things really at that time. And the first patient she saw was a medical professor in his late 60s. And so, again, Mary, add you to the list of those people that I want to say thank you to. And I also want to, and so she was at St. Luke's and Lenox Hospital. I want to hear from Valery, but I want to stop at this point just so that I can get these little bits out and go back to my little tears over here, because Ellen, I think that one of the things you touched on, and we're going to talk about women in the pandemic in a moment, but I think one of the things too that I want to add from the perspective of a patient, not as a physician, as a patient in those years, it was nobody other than the lesbian community that stepped up and were the first first people to organize a buddy program. I was involved with GMHC, Gay Men's Health Crisis at the time. And, the simple fact was that the guys who weren't sick or taking care of somebody who was sick were shunning us and isolating our community. And it was our lesbian and bisexual sisters who stepped in and said, this isn't acceptable. These people are not getting, they can't clean their homes. They can't go grocery shopping. They don't even have somebody to sit with them and talk with them. And firsthand, I know what that was like. And a number of those women were not just lesbians. They were nurses and nurse practitioners and even LPNs who said, these are human beings and they need our care. Valery, tell us what it was like for you during that same period.
Well, you mean Ellen? I'm Valery.
I'm Ellen.
That's right.
So for me, at the beginning in the ICU, when we started to see, it was mostly young men, although we do now recall that we did see several women who we now know had AIDS, as we reviewed for the book. I found myself amazingly curious. I was always interested in the challenge and the attempt to save people that couldn't be saved. Valery and I had many opportunities where we intervened very quickly, say with a trauma patient, an overdose patient, a patient who had a big MI. And, I think we thought at the beginning we could do the same thing for people who we now know had AIDS, but we kept failing and we did not know why. So I found my curiosity piqued. As your viewer said before, Mary, it is true that we drew blood and started IVs without gloves because that's the way we were taught as veteran nurses to do it that way. Mm-hmm. I believe, it probably was later in the 80s before I left Roosevelt Hospital, and when I joined the hospital St. Clair's, that I discovered that that was my calling, as I had witnessed a couple, a man, one of them was dying of pneumocystis and the other was his partner. And I witnessed such love and affection and overwhelmed grief that I knew that there was no other place for me to be. And the first time I saw the ad in the New York Times for the opening of the first designated AIDS center in Manhattan at St. Clair's, I remember thinking to myself, that's where I need to go. And that's started my journey into solely being an AIDS care nurse.
Again, I knew that this was going to be one of the toughest interviews I do because of the emotions involved, and you brought something else up that I'm gonna talk about in a moment. I'm trying to stay on top of the questions at the same time. So Marshall from down in the Carolinas writes, do you believe that AIDS and HIV have actually been around forever, or do you think that it just appeared at that time? I hear that question, quite often, and whichever one of you want to speak to that, as from a clinician standpoint and just from your own observation, because a lot of people don't think that when they think of AIDS, they think we didn't even see AIDS until 1981, because that's when we first started to see the word coined. They don't realize that before that there was GRID. Actually, right up into, depending on where you were in the country, in 1983, when I got PCP the first time, it was still called GRID in South Florida. But it was part of this process of coming to understand that some of these laboratory specimens that the NIH and CDC had collected going back to the 50s showed that there were some men with HIV antibodies in their bloodstream. So go ahead and I'll let you ladies take Marshall's question.
I think that that it's possible that we didn't see the clinical manifestations of HIV infection for a long time because in indolent infections, or slow growing, if you will, infections, which were the first ones that came from Africa, that the infection was slow enough that you didn't see the kind of immune suppression that caused clinical manifestations such as opportunistic illnesses or wasting, generalized lymph nodes like swelling in the neck and armpits. Those are the clinical manifestations of immune suppression. So I think that it's possible that it was around longer than we knew, and I know that some people are interested in that. I have to say that I'm not sure I know, and also it's sort of like the question that we have to ask all the time when we interview a patient: what's your risk for HIV? I don't really care what your risk for HIV is. You already got HIV, we got to deal with it. So why do I care how you happen to acquire HIV? So although I would be interested in an epidemiological sort of way, I don't really know, and I think that somebody may know, but I'm not one of those people who knows. So, but it is an interesting question. It's just one of those things that since I've always had to deal with the fact of where we are right now, it's not something that I ever even had time to look into. But
yes,
so.
and there is the possibility that certainly in Africa and other countries where healthcare was almost non-existent, that people acquired this and just died, and perhaps their death was attributed to other causes before we made it over to the United States, where we had some semblance of reasonable healthcare.
The other thing about HIV is that it's one of those viruses that does not replicate true. So that's what all that mutation stuff is that they talk about. So it's not a virus that has a lot of checks and balances on its replication process because it uses other cells for replication. And so it may have been in existence in Africa or probably Africa for some period of time before it mutated into the extremely infectious and disabling disease it became. So that it's possible it was going on for quite a long time. And humans do develop antibodies, and antibodies should be enough to keep it in check. And for a little while during the early parts of the infection, it's possible that the antibodies are working a little bit. So maybe an indolent infection, people did not get sick right away. Maybe it took 10 years or 15 years. And so that's why we didn't see so many clinical cases of it. The other thing I have hidden in one area is the lack of transportation. And then once air travel became very common, people were visiting and going all over the place. And that's another way that it might have become more commonly seen. And if mutation occurred under those circumstances, it might have become a more virulent illness than it was in the beginning.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And we, again, we don't know what we don't know. But I think what we see, I mean, Anthony asked a question, and congratulations, Anthony, on 23 years happy and healthy pause. I wish you many, many more. What your question, Anthony, about why is it that an AIDS diagnosis is still an AIDS diagnosis when your T cells go over 200? Is while that's a good question, and I'll be happy to talk with you after the show about that from a clinical perspective. I think kind of what we want to talk about today is more because this show is about that queer culture and queer spirituality, and more of the sort of the culture. And this book talks about the what I think is the heroic, nothing short of heroic response within the medical community, particularly coming from the nurses community, because I can tell you firsthand, as you probably know yourself. I mean, I've been full blown since 36 years now. 23 years you've been living healthy in pause. You've seen this yourself. The next point I want to kind of hear from you guys on, you've touched on a few times, and that is that we can look back and say, oh yeah, there was somebody who presented maybe with pneumocystis, who was a woman at that time, and maybe it just completely, we were still saying this is a gay disease, and the woman might have been a heterosexual woman, and so we weren't making those connections. One of the things I noticed in my own circle of friends, as some of my first friends, Allie and some other Lisa, some other straight women who were being diagnosed, and this is a little further on. We're now talking 1981, 82, 83. They were diagnosed, but because when I got started, we were on 1,200 milligrams of AZT, TID. I mean, we're taking 3 times a day, 3 times the toxicity. So we were getting 9 times the toxicity, and those doses of those early medications were killing women before they even had a chance for the HIV to progress. How did you, in those periods of time? I remember it was more horrifying for me as a gay man whose straight female friends were beginning to get sick, to watch the rapid decline that they were making it through PCP, because they were getting the pentam treatments, they were getting aerosolized pentam at home, and they were getting well. And as soon as, we're talking within 90 days of being on those high doses of AZT, between 1,200 and 2,400 milligrams TID, they were rapidly declining and dying. And for both of you as women, what was going through your minds at that time as you're making this courageous effort to be there for largely gay men, and you're seeing women who are not only not responding well to the medications. But at that time, there were absolutely no studies being done on women. There was no effort, to do studies on women until 1990, I believe, or 91, when it was the first time. Talk to me a little bit about that, because I think a lot of folks don't realize that this wasn't like magically in 1991 or 1990 we saw the first woman with HIV. That was when we first started to talk about it. That wasn't when it was happening.
No, I think that HIV has always been very heavily represented, if you will, in particularly in straight women of color. Women of color have been disproportionately affected by HIV since the beginning. I mean, Ellen and I both saw a woman in the ICU. We saw two women. One was a woman of color, one was a white woman. One woman, we had no idea what had happened to her, and one woman was a sex worker, and so we were pretty sure that that's how she had acquired it. She also was an injection drug user, but injection drug use was a very efficient way of spreading HIV, and people who were using injection drugs at the time were not always straight people. So sometimes gay men would inject drugs as well. It wasn't like the crystal meth epidemic, but heroin was a big deal back in those days. But to get back to your discussion about the availability of drugs, I mean, if you think about the timeline of drug development, it took until 1987 to get one drug on board. That was AZT. It was a lousy drug. It had so many toxicities, which you've already mentioned. Many people couldn't take it. Many people couldn't get access to it, and it was extremely expensive. It wasn't until 1991 that DDI came on the scene. And at the time, I can remember having discussions. Ellen and I went to a meeting about whether we should be giving AZT first and then DDI, or give them both together. Nobody had any idea, because remember, we were all, as scientists, we were working in the dark. We did not know the life cycle of the virus. We did not know how it replicated. We knew it was a retrovirus, that's true, but that's about all we knew. And it wasn't until David Ho did his seminal work at Rockefeller that we actually had a good, solid understanding of what was happening. And so that was 1993. So it's no wonder that the therapeutics lagged behind. After that, almost every year there was a new drug in development. But just to sort of put it all into perspective, there was no decent treatment until November of 1995, and also no decent medication, laboratory tests to tell us what we were doing. We didn't have viral loads. All we had were CD4 counts, and that's like looking in the rearview mirror all the time. Okay, that tells me what happened 3 months ago, but that's not telling me what's happening now. And so that we were really working with blinders on. And that's where the nurses stepped in, because science had nothing for this. They had nothing. All there was caring for the patient, caring for the patient's family or loved one, and trying to do the best we could for people, because there were no pills to give them.
I also think that back then, when we're talking about the early days of AZT and just general care, I mean, women of color and women who were injection drug users often didn't seek health care. So we saw a proportionately number of more men coming in for care than we did women at all. And so we would always ask about heterosexual men who had injection drug issues about their female partners to try to get them tested. But often it was that they did not want to come in. They had children to take care of. They had households to take care of. And we could not get women to come in for health care, just as we even do today. There are women who have heart disease who don't seek out health care right away because they have other responsibilities that they consider more important than their own health.
Well, and also it was not exactly a welcoming system, as you recall. It wasn't welcoming for gay people, it wasn't welcoming for women of color, and it wasn't welcoming for women either. So it was kind of an interesting mix of who are you trying to provide health care to? I can remember working in the ICU and going on rounds with this guy, and he said, "No humans here," or "That's a citizen." So if you were a white person of means, then that was a citizen. But if you were a person of color, a gay person, you were not a human being. And he really felt that way. He really did. And a lot of people felt that way. So getting access to healthcare, even for people who were just sort of marginalized at all, was almost an impossibility. And so I think a lot of women stayed away for that reason. And certainly people of color stayed away, and for good reason. It was a good reason to stay away. There wasn't anything that we were going to do for them anyway, because there was nothing.
Yeah, and I noticed that at that at that stage in time, as the meds started to come around, we started to really begin to see the bigger picture in the broader community, especially in New York. And I think in talking to friends of mine, some of whom we've since lost in California, especially San Francisco, in New York, the culture was that there were the docks, and the docks were where largely when I was younger, that's where the IVD the IV drug users hung out, and it's also where those drug addicted individuals would often do anything, quote unquote, for their next fix, to make $20 here or $20 there, and so we didn't want to have those conversations. I mean, certainly the president at that time didn't want to have those conversations, didn't want to even speak the word, and the people that were being the most harshly abused at that time. And so there's some theories that if there was some sort of contaminant that was in the heroin that was being used down on the docks, maybe that was the mode of transmission. Then we began to see some of the more seminal work and understand where the virus was actually coming from. And so it's quite possible that, with the Gaetan Dugas patient 1, patient 0 theory, that the transmission went the other way into the heterosexual community. And these guys were certainly not going to go home and tell their wives or girlfriends or significant others that they were turning tricks down at the docks to get their fix. And these largely wealthy gay men in Manhattan and the Village were not going to go and tell all their friends what they were doing down at the docks. And so this culture of secrecy left in its wake, as you said, a disproportionate number of women who weren't getting tested, who didn't have access to the medications, who couldn't afford the horrible medications. But then when the cocktails started to come around and we started to get a better feel for what was happening, they were still marginalized. They were culturally oppressed. They were socially oppressed. And so here we are in a moment in the 21st century, unbelievably and unspeakably, when once again we're seeing women being marginalized, oppressed, demonized, mischaracterized because of the color of their skin, because of their religious preference, because of who they are, and the threat that poses to society. And I wonder what your experience has been in these later years. And I apologize. We really do try to keep this show to 30 minutes. I knew this one wasn't going to happen. And if you guys have to go, I have to tell our viewers and I get the two of you backwards. So Ellen is the one who had surgery, right? Okay. In my mind, you're one person, and I just love you both dearly. Ellen had surgery on Monday, folks, and is sitting here. So if this gets to be too much, just say, hey, I'm tiring out. I certainly appreciate it. This was one of those days when my sister had a labiectomy this morning, where they found some precancerous cells, and so I was up all night. When I do that, my meds for the HIV and the cardiovascular meds and Parkinson's meds combined do a number on my stomach, and because I'm not eating properly in those moments. So if you need to stop, tell me to stop. I was hurling before we went on the air. Plus, I was nervous about coming in, and I never get nervous about interviewing guests, but this show is a message that's so important. So talk to us, because I think people need to know in the 21st century, what's happening in terms of these marginalized communities, not just women, but also men of color, young adults, as caregivers in the field. What would be the biggest takeaway for you that you want people to bring out of that book, in addition to understanding that just as we had heroes on 9/11, I've felt and said on many of these shows that the heroes, both physically and spiritually and emotionally, for so many of us, of us living with AIDS, that it has been nurse practitioners. My clinical partner and one of my dearest friends in the world will probably be watching this later. She just got her doctorate in nursing down in Spotsylvania, Virginia, and has been one of those people as a wound care nurse where she's seen manifestations. Talk to me a little bit about this disparity that still exists in the communities of color today.
So I want to say a couple of things about that. I think that researchers, and I mean, I've been in the research community for 20 years and also sort of have one foot in the clinical care community as well. But I think that we have definitely recognized the need to make sure that underrepresented and disenfranchised people who would ordinarily not seek care, are drawn into it, or are specifically approached about it. And in fact, to give you an example of how that's accomplished, we'll be told by our networks that we have to have at least 22% women, that we have to have a certain percentage of trans women, that we have to have a certain percentage of people of color in our studies. Otherwise, they're not representing the, who is affected by HIV. And so that has been a tremendous thing in terms of getting women, trans women, and young men of color into clinical studies. The most recent ones that I've worked on in the HPTN studies for prevention, 083 is still going on. It's fully enrolled, but it's still in progress for the next 3 years. It's a prevention effort where they actually funded the kind of outreach that would go to places where young men of color congregate so that they could tell them about the study, because people like that in general are not going to the doctor, and so they're not seeing the kinds of advertisements that we would likely be leaving around, because it's, advertising is incredibly expensive, so nobody's got a budget for that. But we actually hired somebody to go down and cruise the balls and hand out palm cards about our studies to make sure that these guys knew that we were looking for them, and that the transgender women who are heavily represented in the ball scene are also represented in our studies, because those are the people who are getting HIV now, who are acquiring it for the first time now. So our prevention efforts need to be geared towards that. In New York City, the Department of Health has done a terrific job at making the clinics not just accessible, but actually friendly. I don't know if you know Dimitri Daskalakis. He's done an incredible job trying to make the clinics a place where people feel welcome. And that's really big, because they do test and treat. And so people are getting treated immediately. And they take all comers. They have the kinds of hours that work well. They don't ask for payment unless you happen to have insurance. And so I think there has been a huge amount of outreach to underrepresented populations, certainly in the last 5 years, maybe even the last 10 years. I think we've made some good strides.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I haven't been in HIV care since Valery, since our Lenox Hill days, but the same is true with women populations for other issues. I mean, cardiac issues. I've been a CTICU nurse now for the past almost 20 years, and the same is true. Women don't present the same way when they're presenting with an MI, and so they tend to ignore their symptoms. And I think it was the same back then, and it's the same now. But I think, what the purpose of the book is to realize that people need to be treated equally, that we have to get rid of stigma, that we have to get rid of racism, that we have to get rid of inequality, and that we have to do this globally. Valery and I are working now with a gentleman from Malaysia that is working on a project to try to end AIDS in Asia. And one of the ways that he's going to do that is by having our book translated into Malay. He works with an organization called Asia Pacific, and he is now about to be in London talking about this very thing, because in Malaysia is seeing the epidemic now where we saw it in the 80s. People are presenting at the time of diagnosis and sometimes at the time of death.
Yes, have very advanced disease.
So we're looking at all aspects now. I mean, for me especially, who's been I've been back in critical care and teaching. I haven't been in the thick of it as Valery has, but I have been reading and associating with people through this book that are really active in their own communities, and we're talking Nigeria and Indonesia and Africa and Malaysia that are asking Uganda and asking for our assistance. Because some people in those countries think that Valery and I are an organization to reach out to. And it's very disconcerting to say, well, we wrote a book. We're not an organization that offers consultation services. So we're thinking about all these things, that there's so much left to do. And so I think that the book kind of started the ball rolling, but there is much left to do. Even though Valery is going to retire and I'm teaching nursing school, there's still a lot left to do. And we will be participating.
I swear that this is not, that we didn't rehearse this ahead of time, but you guys are giving me perfect segues to each question that I have jotted down. Because, and before I forget, and I want to memorialize this in the video so that you can go back and look at it. In your work in Malaysia, which I was particularly interested in and happy to hear about, there is an organization there called Kechara, Kechara, that is headed by, as with this being a pagan organization, a pagan broadcast, headed by a Buddhist monk whose name is Sem Tulku Rinpoche. They do a lot of work in that particularly marginalized community. So maybe that the person you're working with there on the ground can get in touch with them, and he has a lot of volunteers that may be able to make that possible. And I just wanted to at this point I wanted to say, that it's important for folks that are watching this, who might be part of a particular pagan network or a coven or part of an organization. Understand that in the 21st century, manifestation and presentation of HIV and AIDS quite often includes, the first time a person might even consider getting tested might be after they have an MI. I mean, I had 3 MIs 3 years ago, 2 of them 20 minutes apart, and they were triggered by a reaction to a medication or a combination of medications that didn't work well together. So be mindful to our viewers. Be mindful when you're seeing things like that. Encourage those members of your covens, those members of your social network, those members of on social media who might be presenting with things that we might not think of as HIV related. Part of our responsibility as people coming into our power and people who are very mindful of marginalization of women and people of color, please encourage those folks that you contact to get tested. Most clinics around the United States, especially in bigger cities right now, have begun to adopt the Whitman Walker type of model, where clinics are cover the entire gamut of health issues, because we now recognize this is a disease that doesn't just limit itself to to PCP, or it's not even PCP anymore, to pneumocystis cerevisiae or whatever. It's PCP to me. It's not limited to those kind of illnesses anymore, and sometimes that could be, something as simple as being mindful of somebody who's going through inexplicable depression, anxiety, lack of energy, but I think most of all, after reading the book, you brought me to a place where, after 36 years of being an activist, doing the television shows and everything else, as I started to get caregiver fatigue, um, I read that book and felt reinvigorated to be able to do what we can do. You might be fatigued right now watching this. You might be somebody who's busy worrying about fighting your own battles to stay healthy, but that doesn't mean you can't do something, some little thing. Particularly since most of you watching this are part of the pagan community, that one little thing might be just showing up for somebody else, just being present for somebody. Letting them know that there are books like this. Put the book up on the camera so folks can recognize it when you go to Amazon and you get your copy of Nurses on the Inside: Stories of the HIV/AIDS Epidemic in New York City, by Valery, Hughes, and Ellen Matzer. Okay. Make sure that you consider the possibility of sharing that. The way that I got in touch with these ladies is that a friend of mine handed me their Kindle, and it was the very first book I've ever read on a Kindle. We were heading up actually to the city, and I was worried about my emotions at seeing Ground Zero for the first time since 9/11. And I got past that because I was in a pool of tears, which started out just tears that just brought to the surface the emotions of being a person living with AIDS. But by the end of that book, they were tears of profound gratitude for the many people like yourselves and the people whose stories you tell in the book. I can't thank you enough, and I know that there are people watching this show right now who would want to express that to you. And so, for those who are watching, and for including those like Mary Marcus, who's a caregiver yourselves, this gratitude goes to you too, Mary, to you, Deb Cannon, to all of the people that are out there that I know are in there doing the fight every single day, to my nurse practitioner, Vonda, so many others, that I thank you ladies for, for writing the book, for bringing this to the conversation. And I ask our viewers to keep that conversation going. Share the book, share the stories, get the book, and I know that it's difficult. I'm somebody who's been trying to watch Pose, and I'm only halfway through the first season because every episode seems to take me 3 days to watch, because there are times I have to walk away, disengage, and go in the bedroom and just sob. But I promise you guys, that's part of the healing process. That's part of the process that gets us through to tomorrow. And this book for me has become part of that conversation, has become part of that journey. So as we wrap up, anything you guys want to offer in terms of a takeaway, in terms of your hope for what this book accomplishes in the future, and then I'll say my goodbyes.
Well, I think one thing that we are also trying to get at is to train a whole new generation of healthcare workers, for us nurses and perhaps other medical professionals, on compassion and empathy, because it's gotten particularly lacking these days. And that's what I try to do in my position as a faculty at a nursing school. So I think that's a real takeaway. And And Valery and I also were reinvigorated. Every time I wrote a story and I sent it to her, and she would email me back or call me and say, this one just broke me up. I remembered this. And the same thing with me for her. I mean, as we were reliving these memories so exquisitely, I think we both got reinvigorated into, okay, what do we do next? And that's why we're doing all these interviews, and we are trying to start a viral wave, if you will, for people who want to be compassionate healthcare workers and compassionate people to take care of our own and take care of people of the world, because it is so lacking right now, as we know, politically and socially here, and there's just so much to be done, and we would like to do our part. Valery?
Yes, one of the main reasons we wrote the book was so that we wouldn't forget, so that nobody would forget what happened, because this could happen again. It doesn't have to even be HIV that causes it. But if we allow our prejudices and our ignorance to allow stigma to persist, that's what diseases are looking for. They're looking for that kind of behavior in order to proliferate themselves. So they will take human bad behavior and take advantage of it. So we have to be above all that. We have to remember that we are one world and that we need to care for our people. And that means supporting insurance for all and recognizing humans are humans. And the fact that you discussed Pose is really kind of a great entree for me, because I just started to watch it myself. And I want to say that if anybody doesn't have an idea about the absolute cost of stigma, please watch Pose, because it totally develops that in such a very beautiful and touching way. I'm with you. I can't get through one episode without crying. And to remind myself of what I've had, my privilege, and what other people have not had. And we need to share that. We need to share it with everybody. So it's wonderful. We need to take care of our people.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Thank you for remembering, for memorializing, for those who, for speaking for those who don't have a voice. And guys, it really does come down to compassion. And that was the tie-in for why we're doing this broadcast today, and why I ask you more than any broadcast we've done, please share this, like it, tell your friends about it, so that they can become not just so that they can get the book, but so that they can become more mindful as we go forward for the need, and I think for those of us that are survivors, for the responsibility that comes with being a long-term survivor, so that people do not forget, because these stories, especially the stories of the marginalized, especially the stories of communities that are underserved, are far too easy to forget, and they're far too easy to dismiss. And while my CD4 has been as low as 29 and is presently at about 186, I know that no day on this planet is guaranteed, and couldn't help but notice, watching the debates last night, that while some candidates or some people might look at candidates like Marianne Williamson and say she is really wackadoodle, I've known her for most of my adult life. I met her and the late Dr. Louise Hay right after my diagnosis in 1983, and got to work with her on several projects, including Project Angel Food. And I can tell you one thing that I take away from every time she speaks, is that the people that are the greatest visionaries often don't have the vernacular for what I call the Muggle mind. But what she said last night resonated with truth for me. That we are facing a crisis in our country, a crisis that, as Valery said, you could manifest again as another pandemic. It doesn't have to be the HIV/AIDS pandemic, but these are crises that are happening in our world that can only be solved by setting aside our fear, And in A Course in Miracles, it says whatever is not fear. I mean, whatever is not love is fear. Whatever is not fear is love. When we recognize that the solution, by watching things like Pose, by having the difficult conversations, by being willing to let the emotions come out, then the only thing that I think that can happen humanly is to respond with compassion, to respond with awareness. And so that brings us to the end of our show. Thank you both so much, Valery, Hughes, Ellen, Matzer. The book is called Nurses on the Inside. Go to Amazon and pick up your copy. In everywhere that this is distributed, there will be a link, including on our podcast, on our website. Again, our website, for those who want to watch this or share this with others, you can see right down below, inneralchemy.online. And you can catch us on Facebook at the web address over on the other side. I keep forgetting this camera goes backwards. Facebook.com/groups /the Brew. To both of you, thank you so much for being here. And everybody else, as we say at the end of every one of these broadcasts, the key to surviving this life on this planet and getting out in one piece, as we all eventually will do, is bringing your awareness back to the moment, filling that moment with gratitude, filling that moment with compassion, and filling that moment with a willingness to do your part. And when you fill the moment with gratitude for what you've got, then it opens the door for the possibilities for healing, the possibilities for more, and the possibilities to touch the lives of others. So thanks for being here, everybody. I appreciate you ladies staying with us for a full hour, and I wish you well with the book, and anything that we can do in the future to help promote it. Let us know. We're here to do so.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
And everybody else, this is John Michael signing off. Love you, and we'll talk to you next week.